Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I walked into my son's house that night, believing Christmas might bring peace, but behind the glow of the lights and the smell of roasted turkey, I was already the outsider. I had spent my life sacrificing for Mark, paying tuition, helping him buy his first home, carrying burdens in silence. Yet one cruel sentence from Rachel at that table shattered every illusion of family. What none of them realized was that my silence was not weakness. It was the beginning of everything that would change a month later. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted through the air as I walked into my son's house that evening. Christmas lights blinked gently from the windows, and the sound of carols floated from the living room stereo. For a moment, I told myself this would be a peaceful night, one where family could sit together and forget the small resentments that had grown over the years. I clutched the scarf my late husband had given me long ago and stepped into the dining room where the table was set with silverware that gleamed under the chandelier. Mark came out from the kitchen carrying a tray of mashed potatoes. He smiled briefly when he saw me, but the smile faded quickly as Rachel followed behind him with her perfect posture and calculating eyes. Ruth, my neighbor and friend, had already been invited to join. She waved warmly at me from her seat near the end of the table. I placed my small gift bag under my chair and sat down quietly, hoping to blend into the background. Dinner began pleasantly enough. We said grace, and for a little while the only sounds were the clinking of forks and the low murmur of conversation. Ruth asked about my garden, and I described the roses that had managed to bloom even in the cold December air. Mark asked about the choir at church, and I told him they were preparing for New Year's service. Rachel laughed lightly at something on her phone and then placed it aside with a sigh that seemed rehearsed. As the plates filled with ham and green beans, conversation shifted. Rachel began talking about her latest real estate clients, how she had closed 2 deals before the end of the year. She spoke with pride and glanced at Mark as if reminding him that she was the one who brought in real money. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a piece of turkey, slowly trying not to notice the way she emphasized her success. Ruth complimented the meal, and I nodded in agreement, telling Mark the turkey was perfectly cooked. For a brief second, I thought I saw warmth in his eyes again, like the boy I had raised who used to beam when I praised him. But Rachel cut in quickly, remarking on how she had brined the turkey herself, how she had researched the best method online, and how she had planned the entire menu. Silence settled for a beat. I sipped my water, deciding it was best not to argue. I reminded myself it was Christmas and peace was worth more than any response I could give. But then it happened. Rachel set her fork down with a loud clatter and leaned forward. Her voice carried across the table, sharp and filled with disdain. "Get a job and stop being a leech." The words struck me harder than any slap could have. My chest tightened, and for a moment I felt the room spin. Ruth's fork froze in her hand. Mark's eyes widened, but he said nothing. The Christmas lights flickered from the tree in the corner, suddenly garish and mocking. I forced myself to stay still. I pressed my palms against my lap under the table nails, digging into the fabric of my skirt to keep from trembling. My instinct screamed to answer back, to defend the years of sacrifices, the long nights I had worked, double shifts, the tuition payments, the down payment for their first home. Instead, I kept silent. Ruth cleared her throat as if to break the tension, but the weight of Rachel's words hung heavy. Mark shifted in his seat, his lips parting as though he might speak, then closing again. He reached for his glass of wine and took a sip, staring at the tablecloth. Rachel leaned back in her chair, satisfied, her smile small and cruel. She picked up her fork again, stabbing a piece of green bean with a flourish, as if nothing had happened. The clatter of utensils resumed awkward and forced, but the warmth of the dinner was gone. Inside memories rushed through me. I saw myself decades earlier holding baby Mark in my arms, promising him I would do whatever it took to give him a better life. I remembered the nights working as a teacher and then tutoring after hours just to save a little more. I remembered selling jewelry to cover his college books. All those moments, all that sacrifice, and now, here I sat, labeled a burden in front of everyone. I looked at Mark again, hoping for something, a glance of defense, a word, anything. He kept his eyes on his plate, chewing slowly, his face pale. My heart ached more for his silence than for Rachel's insult. Ruth finally attempted small talk, asking about the weather forecast for New Year's Eve. No one truly answered. The cheer of the holiday had drained from the room. I sat quietly, swallowing the lump in my throat, pushing the food around my plate. The flavors had turned to ash in my mouth. I thought about leaving, about standing up and walking into the cold night just to breathe. But I stayed seated, hands folded tightly, waiting for the moment to pass. Rachel laughed softly again, a laugh that felt sharp as broken glass. The sound echoed in my ears as I stared at the twinkling lights strung across the window. For the rest of the meal, I spoke very little. Ruth tried to carry the conversation, bless her heart, but the damage had already been done. The dinner ended quietly, plates half-finished, glasses only partly emptied. I gathered my scarf and gift bag, thanked Ruth for her company with a faint smile, and stood to leave. Mark walked me to the door without a word of apology. He opened it, letting the cold air rush in. I stepped outside the night, biting against my skin, and for a moment I lifted my eyes to the stars, wondering how everything had changed so much. I walked down the path toward my car, the crunch of frost beneath my shoes, my heart heavy and silent. I did not look back at the glowing windows behind me. The drive home that night felt endless. Even though the streets of Seattle were quiet and nearly empty, Christmas decorations still glowed in shop windows and porches sparkled with lights, but none of it warmed me. My hands clutched the steering wheel, stiff and cold, despite the heater humming in the car. I replayed every moment of the dinner in my head, each glance, each silence, and most of all, the sting of Rachel's voice cutting through the room. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically. The familiar sight of my house should have comforted me, but instead it pressed down on me, reminding me how alone I was walking into it. I carried the gift bag I had brought for Mark and Rachel unopened and unwanted, and placed it on the counter without a word. I shrugged off my coat and boots and moved slowly through the living room, switching on a lamp. The soft glow revealed the shelves lined with books and photographs, every frame a memory of the life I had built with David. My eyes landed on the wedding photo, the two of us so young and hopeful, and I felt my throat tighten. I lowered myself onto the couch and let the silence wash over me. The furnace rattled faintly, the clock ticked, but otherwise the house sat still. The stillness was louder than the shouting at dinner. It echoed with what had been said and what had not been said, with Mark's silence that cut deeper than Rachel's words. My gaze drifted to the mantel where a framed picture of David stood. I rose, crossed the room, and lifted it into my hands. His steady smile looked back at me as if to say he still believed in me, still trusted me. Tears blurred my vision. I pressed the frame to my chest, whispering his name. I thought of the sacrifices that had brought me here. working double shifts at school when Mark was little, staying up late, grading papers, tutoring on weekends. I thought of how I skipped vacations, bought secondhand clothes, and quietly let go of things I wanted so Mark could have a new bicycle or the best calculator for math class. I remembered the year David and I argued in hushed voices about selling my bracelet and earrings gifts he had saved for just to cover another semester of tuition. I sold them anyway and told him it was worth it, that Mark's future meant more. When Mark and Rachel got married, I wanted to give them stability. $50,000, nearly every penny I had saved, went into their first home. I told myself I was helping them build the kind of security David and I had fought so hard to create. It felt like a piece of my heart went with that money, like giving them a part of myself and of him. Now I sat in this house, valued at over $1 million, the house David and I had bought together decades ago, and felt like an unwelcome guest at my own family's table. Rachel's words echoed again. "Get a job and stop being a leech." My jaw clenched as I heard it in my head. Leech. After everything I had given, after every sacrifice, that was what I had become in her eyes. I set the picture frame down gently, walked into the kitchen. The table there was small, just enough for 2 people. I could see David sitting across from me, sipping his coffee and reading the paper. I pulled out a chair and sat running my hands across the worn wood. I could also see Mark as a child sitting there, his little legs swinging, asking me if Santa would bring him a baseball glove, and later as a teenager complaining about homework. I had been there for every stage, present in every way I could be, and tonight he let his wife shame me without a word in my defense. I poured myself a glass of water, the faucet gurgling as it filled. I sipped slowly, but the water could not wash away the bitterness in my mouth. The humiliation wrapped around me like a heavy coat I could not shed. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Ruth asked if I had gotten home safe. I typed back yes, then hesitated before adding, "Thank you for being there." Her reply came almost instantly always. The word steadied me, reminded me I was not entirely alone in this. Still, the ache in my chest remained. I carried the glass to the sink, rinsed it, and set it down. Then I returned to the living room and pulled the blanket from the armchair over my lap. The house smelled faintly of pine from the tree in the corner. The ornaments collected over so many years shimmered softly. The star at the top, carved by David's hands, caught the light. It used to bring me joy. Tonight it felt like it belonged to another lifetime. I whispered into the quiet, asking David what he would have done. Would he have defended me, spoken with the authority that always silenced any insult? Would he have stood beside me, reminding our son of who had raised him? I tried to imagine his voice in the silence, but heard only the hum of the furnace. The weight of exhaustion pulled at me, so I rose and made my way down the hall to the bedroom. The queen bed looked impossibly large, a reminder of the space David had left behind. I set his photo on the nightstand and traced my fingers over the frame. I undressed slowly, changed into my nightgown, and slid beneath the covers. I stared into the darkness, eyes open wide. I replayed the moment Rachel said those words, her smirk, the way she sat back satisfied. I replayed Mark's silence, his refusal to speak up. That cut deeper than anything else. For all I had given, for all I had endured, he left me alone in that moment. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. Memories rose, unbidden, years of sacrifice, years of love, all clouded by tonight's humiliation. My chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, and finally I whispered again into the night, asking David what I should do. The clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. At last, with tears still damp on my cheeks, I drifted into a restless sleep, clutching the blanket as if it could hold me together. The morning came gray and heavy, the kind of winter light that made everything outside look muted and tired. I woke with a dull ache in my chest, and the memory of Rachel's voice still cutting through me like glass. My head pounded from lack of sleep. I pulled myself out of bed and shuffled to the kitchen, switched on the coffee maker and leaned against the counter, waiting for the familiar gurgle to begin. The smell of brewing coffee filled the room, but even that comfort could not push away the humiliation pressing down on me. I sat at the small table with my mug staring at the frost clinging to the backyard fence. Every sip tasted bitter. I told myself over and over that it had only been words, yet words carried more weight than stones sometimes. My son's silence at that table hurt even more than Rachel's cruelty. That silence carved itself into me in a way I could not ignore. I tried to busy myself with chores. I watered the poinsettias in the window, wiped the counters, even though they were already clean, and folded the blanket I had left on the couch. I walked from room to room, touching the backs of chairs and running my hand along the banister as if grounding myself. None of it worked. The echo of the dinner clung to me like smoke. By late morning, I could not stand being alone with my thoughts. I put on my coat, wrapped my scarf tightly around my neck, and stepped outside. The cold bit at my cheeks, the air sharp in my lungs. Snow still clung to the lawns in uneven patches. My boots crunched against the icy ground as I walked the short distance to Ruth's house. Her home looked warm and welcoming, smoke curling from the chimney, a wreath on the front door. I knocked, and within seconds she opened it with her familiar kind smile. She pulled me inside, brushing snowflakes from my coat, and guided me toward the kitchen. The smell of cinnamon and freshly baked bread surrounded me like a blanket. "Sit down," she said softly, already pouring tea into a mug. I obeyed, my hands wrapping around the warm ceramic. We sat in silence for a long moment, the ticking of her kitchen clock filling the space. Finally, I found my voice. Rachel called me a leech. The words broke out of me and hung there heavier than the steam rising from my cup. Ruth's expression darkened. She shook her head slowly. "Mary, that woman has no idea what you've done for your family." She reached across the table and laid her hand over mine. "I don't want to hear you repeat those words as if they were true." I blinked against the sting of tears. I tried to defend Mark, said he was under pressure, that Rachel controlled him, that maybe he had not known how to react. Even as I said it, I knew I was excusing him. Ruth listened patiently, then squeezed my hand again. "Silence is a choice too," she said. "You've given that boy everything, and last night he gave you nothing back." The truth of it settled into me, painful and undeniable. I looked down at the steam curling from my tea and thought of the nights I had spent working long hours, the jewelry I had sold, the money I had given without hesitation. To have it dismissed in one sentence and ignored by my own son left a wound I did not know how to close. Ruth leaned back in her chair and studied me. "Mary, you still have more power than you think. You have your home, your savings, everything David worked for with you. Don't let them make you feel small." I shook my head. What good is any of that when it only drives us further apart? I don't want a war with my own son. "It isn't war," she said firmly. "It's protection. There's a difference." She told me about a lawyer she knew, Richard Thompson, a man in his late 40s who specialized in estate law. She explained how he had helped her cousin secure assets when a greedy relative tried to interfere. He is fair practical, and he knows how to make sure people like Rachel can't take what isn't theirs. The thought of involving a lawyer made me flinch. It felt like betrayal, as if putting legal boundaries between me and my son meant admitting our family bond had broken. I told Ruth that. She listened quietly and then said, "Sometimes the best way to save a family is to make sure no one can tear it apart in the first place." Her words struck deeper than I expected. The room fell quiet except for the low hum of the furnace. Outside the window, snowflakes began to fall again, slow and deliberate, coating the neighborhood in white. I thought of how fragile everything looked, how easily tracks in the snow disappeared with just one more layer falling. Ruth poured more tea into my cup, her eyes never leaving me. "Just meet him," she urged. "Talking to him doesn't mean you have to do anything. It will give you peace of mind." I stared into the amber liquid, my reflection rippling on the surface. She was right. Knowledge did not have to mean action. It only meant I would not be blindsided if Rachel tried again. And Rachel would try again. That much I knew in my bones. I drew in a long breath and nodded slowly. "All right, I'll meet him." Relief softened Ruth's face and she smiled gently. "That's all I ask." She reached for my hand one more time, squeezing it with quiet strength. When I left her house, the air outside felt sharper against my skin, but inside I carried something different. A small ember of resolve, fragile, but real. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked back across the yard. For the first time since that dinner, I did not feel entirely powerless. I still ached, still feared what might come, but I knew this much with certainty. I could not let silence be my answer forever. The appointment was set for a Tuesday afternoon the week after Christmas. I drove into downtown Seattle with my stomach in knots, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than they should have. Traffic was light, the city still in a holiday lull, but my mind raced with what I was about to do. I parked in a garage near an office building of glass and steel, the kind of place where people walked with purpose and carried leather briefcases. For a moment, I sat in the car and told myself I could turn around, that there was still time to pretend none of this was necessary. But then Rachel's voice came back sharp as ever, and I forced myself out of the seat. Inside the building smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. The elevator carried me to the 10th floor, where a brass plaque read, "Thompson and Myers Estate Law." The receptionist greeted me kindly and asked me to wait. I sat in a leather chair, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt, listening to the soft music playing overhead. My heart beat faster when the door opened, and a man in his late 40s stepped out. He was tall with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Mary," he said warmly, "Ruth told me a little about your situation. Why don't you come in and we can talk?" I followed him into his office, lined with shelves of heavy books. Framed certificates hung neatly on the wall, proof of his years of practice. I settled into the chair across from his desk and folded my hands tightly in my lap. "Tell me what brings you here," he said gently. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. I told him about the Christmas dinner, about Rachel's cruel insult, about Mark's silence. My voice shook as I admitted how humiliated I had felt. Then I told him the part that mattered most, how I had given Mark money in the past, how I feared Rachel might try to take what was left. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression calm but focused. When I finished, I felt empty, as if I had poured out everything I had carried for years. "Mary," he said at last, "I think it is time we review the trust your husband created before he passed. Do you have the documents?" I nodded. I had brought the folder from my safe deposit box, papers David and I had signed years earlier, but that I had not looked at closely since his death. My hands trembled as I handed them over. Thompson adjusted his glasses and flipped through each page with practiced ease. "Here it is," he said after a few minutes. "The trust was created in 2015. Your late husband placed both your primary residence and a savings account of $500,000 into it. According to the terms, you are the sole trustee and beneficiary. No one else has legal claim unless you name them." The words washed over me, and for a moment I did not quite believe them. He repeated them slowly, pointing to the clauses and signatures. It was all clear. The house I lived in valued now at over $1 million, and the savings account, everything was already protected in my name. Rachel and Mark. I whispered, "They don't know." He shook his head. "They don't need to. Unless you choose to disclose it, this information remains private. But you should also know that nothing Rachel or Mark does can override this trust. You are safe, Mary. Safe." The word felt foreign after so many years of worrying, of trying to give and give, until I had nothing left. I leaned back in the chair, the tension in my shoulders loosening. All this time, the power had been mine, and I had forgotten it. I remembered the day David and I had signed the documents. He had insisted on it, said he wanted to make sure I would never be left vulnerable. At the time, I thought it was unnecessary. I told him our son would always take care of me. He had looked at me with those steady eyes and said it was better to be prepared. He had been right. I felt my throat tighten and my eyes burn. I whispered more to myself than to Thompson. I trusted my son so much that I never looked at these papers again. Thompson spoke gently. "Trust is a gift, but it must be protected. You honored your family by giving, but you must honor yourself by keeping what is yours." I nodded slowly, absorbing every word. The shame from Christmas dinner began to shift into something else, something stronger. For the first time in years, I realized I was not a helpless widow being judged by her daughter-in-law. I was the woman David had trusted with his life's work. Thompson explained the practical steps. Keep the documents in a secure place. Notify the bank that I remained the trustee. Consider drafting a letter of intent if I wanted to decide how assets should be distributed in the future. His voice was calm and steady, grounding me in the reality of what this meant. When the meeting ended, he shook my hand again. "Remember, Mary, knowledge is power. You do not need to act today, but knowing the truth gives you strength." I thanked him and walked out of the office, the folder pressed tightly against my chest. The elevator ride down felt lighter than the one that had carried me up. Outside, the city bustled with cars and people, but for once, I did not feel lost among them. Driving home, I thought of Rachel's smug smile at the dinner table, of the way Mark had looked away. A slow heat spread through me, not of shame this time, but of clarity. They had no idea that the very foundation of their lives rested on me. I pulled into my driveway as the winter sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the lawn. I stepped inside the house, closed the door, and placed the folder carefully back into the safe where it belonged. Then I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the photographs of David of Mark as a child of holidays long gone. For the first time since that awful dinner, I felt something steady inside me. The power had never left. I had simply forgotten to use it. The days after that meeting passed quietly, each one slipping into the next as the year wound down. The city was alive with New Year preparations, fireworks, stands on corners, banners strung across store windows, people carrying bags of champagne and party hats. Yet inside my house, the air remained still. I moved through the rooms softly, keeping my secrets tucked away as carefully as the documents in my safe. I cooked simple meals, tidied the living room, and watched the news in the evenings. The quiet might have looked like surrender to anyone watching from the outside, but inside me, something different was building. I remembered Thompson's words that knowledge was power, and I carried that knowledge like a hidden flame. Rachel seemed convinced that she had broken me. I heard from Ruth that Rachel had bragged to some of the women in her real estate circle that her mother-in-law was finally out of the way, that she no longer had to worry about me interfering. I could imagine the smirk on her face as she told them I was just an old woman depending on scraps. The thought made my stomach twist, but I said nothing. Let her believe what she wanted. One afternoon, Emily showed up at my door with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her long hair tucked under a knit hat. She hugged me tightly when I opened the door. "Aunt Mary," she said, "I just wanted to check on you." I made hot cocoa and we sat at the kitchen table. She told me about her first semester at the University of Washington, about her classes in psychology, and how overwhelming the finals had been. I listened, smiling at her energy, grateful for the sound of a young voice filling the house. Eventually, she grew quiet and studied me with those perceptive eyes of hers. "I heard what happened at Christmas," she said softly. "Mom told me." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Emily reached across the table and took my hand. "You don't deserve that. You've always been the strongest person I know. Don't let her words take that from you." Her touch steadied me more than she could know. I squeezed her hand and managed a smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. Sometimes it is easier to let people believe what they want than to fight back right away." Emily tilted her head. "But you won't let her win, right?" I looked into her earnest eyes and felt something tighten inside me. "No," I said. "I won't let her win." We talked a little longer about her classes, her friends, her hopes for the new year. When she left, I stood at the window watching her walk down the street, her figure small against the fading afternoon light. I felt a flicker of pride knowing that despite everything, I had helped shape a young woman with kindness and strength. Later that week, I had to stop by Mark and Rachel's house to drop off some papers for a community event Ruth and I were organizing. Rachel opened the door with that sharp smile of hers. She invited me in briefly while Mark was out. I kept my words polite and neutral, not giving her any hint of what I had learned from Thompson. As I waited in the hallway, I overheard Rachel on the phone in the next room. Her voice carried easily. She was laughing, telling someone that her mother-in-law had finally been put in her place. She said I was no threat, that I was just a burden she had to tolerate for appearances. She lowered her voice then, but I caught the final words as clear as if she had whispered them into my ear. "She doesn't dare do anything." Something inside me went very still. I stood there with the envelope in my hand, my face calm, my heart beating steadily. She thought she had won, thought she had silenced me. That certainty was her weakness. When she returned still smiling, I handed her the papers and said nothing of what I had heard. I simply told her to give my regards to Mark and walked back out into the cold evening air. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the snow. Back in my own house, I lit a small lamp and sat down in the armchair. The quiet surrounded me again, but this time it did not feel suffocating. Rachel's words, her arrogance, had given me something I had not expected. They gave me clarity. She believed I had no power, but I knew better now. I had the trust, the documents, the proof. I had the strength David had made sure to leave in my hands. The last days of the year slipped away the neighborhood preparing for celebrations, fireworks popping in the distance at night. I remained silent, letting the world think I was still wounded. In truth, I was gathering myself, waiting for the right moment. When the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, I raised a quiet toast alone in my kitchen, my glass filled with sparkling cider. I whispered a promise into the stillness not to let myself be diminished again. The house stood steady around me, the trust papers safe, the memory of Rachel's mocking voice fueling the resolve that was no longer hidden but growing stronger with every passing day. The first week of January dragged on with skies the color of slate and rain that never seemed to stop. I spent most mornings looking out the window at the drizzle streaking down the glass, holding a cup of coffee and wondering what the new year would bring. I tried to keep busy with housework, but no amount of sweeping or cooking dulled the sound of Rachel's mocking words. It felt like a challenge whispered into my ear, daring me to prove her wrong. It was on a Tuesday when Mark called, his voice subdued, almost hesitant. "Mom, can I come by tonight? I need to talk." Something in his tone pulled at me, a reminder of the boy he used to be, but layered now with weariness I couldn't ignore. I told him yes, and all day I prepared myself, unsure of what conversation awaited. When he arrived, his face looked drawn, his dark hair unkempt, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He carried the weight of someone carrying not just his own burdens, but Rachel's expectations too. I set out a fresh pot of coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, steam rising between us. He rubbed his temples before speaking. "Things aren't good at Evergreen. We lost 2 contracts at the end of December, and the new year hasn't started the way we hoped. Rachel keeps pushing me to expand into commercial development, but the banks are hesitant." He exhaled sharply. "We're stretched too thin, Mom." I stayed quiet, letting him talk. His words tumbled out in fragments, frustration mixed with a strange longing. I heard beneath it not only fear of failure, but the pressure of a wife who demanded more than he could give. Then he shifted his eyes, searching mine. "You've always been there for me. For us. You helped with school, with the house. Maybe you could help just once more. Alone, something to get us through this rough patch." The request landed like a stone in my chest. For years, my reflex had always been yes. Whatever he needed, I found a way. But this time, something in me held steady. I asked him what his plan was, how he would repay it, what guarantee he could give me that things would change. He fumbled with vague promises, his gaze slipping from mine. "You don't trust me, do you?" He muttered, his voice tinged with accusation. I breathed deeply before answering. "I do trust you, Mark. But trust isn't about handing over money every time something goes wrong. Trust is about believing you can find your own strength." His jaw tightened. "Rachel says you're holding back, that you don't even need the money you have." I felt my pulse quicken at the mention of her name. This wasn't just Mark asking. This was Rachel's influence seeping into every word. I set my cup down firmly. "I have given you more than you realize. What I have left is not just money. It's my security, the future your father wanted for me." For a moment he looked stricken, torn between guilt and pride. Then he slumped back in his chair, his shoulders heavy. "I don't know what to do," he admitted quietly. "Everything feels like it's slipping away." I wanted to reach for him, to pull him into the safety of a mother's embrace, but I forced myself to stay still. Protecting him didn't always mean giving him what he asked for. Sometimes it meant letting him face the weight of his own choices. 2 nights later, he came again, but this time, he brought someone with him. James. His old college friend stepped through my doorway with a firm handshake and a look of concern. I hadn't seen James in years, but he carried the steady air of someone who had learned a thing or two about responsibility. We sat in the living room, the lamp casting a warm glow over us. Rachel had stayed behind, claiming she had calls to make, though I suspected she wanted to avoid hearing what James might say. James didn't waste time. "Mark, I know you're under pressure, but leaning on your mom every time the company stumbles isn't a strategy. Evergreen needs structure, not handouts. If Rachel is pushing for expansion, she's pushing you into dangerous territory. The market isn't ready." Mark bristled, defensive. "I'm just trying to keep everything together." James leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "I know, but you can't keep using your mom as a safety net. One day she won't be able to catch you, and then what?" The words landed heavy in the room. I watched Mark struggle with them, his pride battling the truth he didn't want to admit. He finally sighed, looking at me as if pleading for me to intervene. "Mom, please. You could help us just this once. I promise I'll pay you back." I felt the ache in my chest again, the old pull to rescue him, but I thought of David, of the trust, of the promise I had made to myself. I shook my head slowly. "No, Mark. Not this time." His face hardened, his eyes flashing with hurt and anger. He stood abruptly, the coffee table rattling slightly as his knee hit it. "You've changed," he said bitterly. "Maybe Rachel was right about you." He left with James following behind, trying to calm him, leaving the door to close harder than it needed to. The house fell quiet, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. I sat still, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart aching yet resolute. For the first time in my life, I had told my son no. It felt like a wound and a shield all at once. The pain of his disappointment burned, but beneath it there was strength I had not felt in years. I knew this was only the beginning of a storm, but I also knew I had taken the first step toward standing on solid ground. A few days later, I was sitting in my living room reading when the phone rang. It was Richard Thompson. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made me set my book aside immediately. "Mary," he said, "I think you should know about something that happened this morning. A bank contacted me after noticing irregularities on a loan application. Your name was listed as a guarantor, but the signature didn't match." For a moment I could not breathe. My heart thudded heavily as I gripped the receiver tighter. "Are you telling me Rachel tried to use my name?" The lawyer confirmed it. He explained that the bank had flagged the application because they already had my information on file from the trust accounts. They knew this signature wasn't mine. They called his office since he was listed as my representative. The application was suspended and would not move forward. I closed my eyes and pressed my free hand against my chest. Anger welled up inside me, sharp and hot. It was one thing for Rachel to insult me, another for her to pressure Mark, but this was fraud. This was crossing a line that could not be ignored. "Thank you for letting me know," I said quietly. "Please keep me informed of any further attempts." After hanging up, I paced the floor of my living room, my hands trembling. The nerve she had thinking she could sign my name, thinking no one would notice. She truly believed I was powerless. Later that evening, Ruth stopped by with a loaf of banana bread. She noticed the tension in my shoulders before I even said a word. I told her what had happened, my voice tight with fury. Ruth shook her head, disbelief written on her face. "That woman has no limits, Mary. But you do not have to let her get away with this." I nodded, still shaken. Inside me, a new resolve was hardening. Rachel thought she could manipulate the system, bend rules, and twist people to her will. She didn't realize I was watching and that I was no longer the silent mother-in-law she dismissed so easily. That night, unable to sleep, I imagined her reaction when the bank informed her the application had been denied. I pictured the way her eyes would narrow, the sharpness in her tone, the anger she would hurl at Mark for not controlling me. The thought made me both anxious and oddly comforted. For once, she would taste frustration. The next day, Ruth called to tell me she had run into someone who had seen Rachel in the parking lot of a downtown bank. Apparently, Rachel had stormed out, phone pressed to her ear, her face red with anger. I could imagine every detail as if I had been standing there myself. Sure enough, that evening, I heard the aftermath through Mark. He called, his tone caught between apology and exasperation. Mom Rachel said the bank rejected her application. They claimed there was some issue with your signature. She swears she didn't know what happened. I bit back the urge to laugh bitterly. Instead, I kept my tone even. Of course the bank rejected it, Mark, because I didn't sign anything. Silence stretched on the other end. Finally, he sighed. Rachel just wants us to get ahead, Mom. She thinks this property could change everything. My voice hardened. If she wants to take risks, she can do it with her own name, not mine. He didn't answer right away. I could hear him shifting, torn between loyalty to his wife and the truth staring him in the face. I ended the call before he could try to soften it with excuses. Across town in her pristine kitchen, Rachel must have been pacing her heels, clicking against the tile. I could almost hear her shouting into the phone, blaming the bank representative for not pushing it through, cursing my name for standing in her way. When Mark told me later that she had slammed her phone down so hard it cracked the screen, I was not surprised. She had crossed into dangerous territory and she knew it. But instead of pulling back, Rachel doubled down. Mark came to see me a few days later, his face drawn. His words clipped. Rachel says you are making things harder than they need to be. She says you could help us, but you refuse. I met his eyes steady and unflinching. That is because she tried to use my name without asking. That is fraud, Mark. Do you understand? He looked away, shame flickering across his features. He muttered that Rachel hadn't meant any harm, that she was desperate. Desperation is no excuse, I said firmly. The conversation ended with him leaving in silence, his shoulders hunched. I watched from the window as he walked down the driveway, the weight of his marriage and his choices pressing him down. That night, as I sat alone with David's picture, I whispered the truth to myself. Rachel had made me into an enemy, but she had underestimated me. She thought I would bow under pressure, but instead I felt stronger than ever. Somewhere across town, Rachel was probably plotting her next move, vowing to force me into submission. I could almost hear her angry vow, the promise that she would make me pay for standing in her way. What she didn't know was that the more she pushed, the more she revealed just how fragile her power really was. The night after Rachel's fury with the bank, the tension between her and Mark began to seep into every corner of their home. I did not see it firsthand at first, but whispers of their arguments reached me through Emily, who often stopped by to collect supplies for her volunteer project. Then one evening, while I was dropping off a box of coats at their house, I found myself hearing more than I ever intended. The porch light was on, casting a harsh glow over the steps as I climbed them with the heavy box in my arms. I was about to knock when Rachel's voice cut through the walls, sharp and slicing loud enough to freeze me in place. "You can't even control your own mother, Mark. She's making fools out of us. Do you realize how pathetic this looks?" Mark's voice came back louder than I expected, filled with strain. "Don't call her pathetic. You humiliated her at Christmas, and now you tried to sign her name behind her back. Do you know how dangerous that was?" I lowered the box gently to the porch floor, my hands trembling. Through the window I could see them in the living room, Rachel pacing like a caged animal, Mark with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight. Rachel scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. "At least I take risks. At least I'm trying to build something." "What are you doing, Mark? Sitting there waiting for handouts. Your mother has you wrapped around her little finger and you're too weak to admit it." Mark stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Weak. That's what you think. Maybe I've been weak, but not in the way you mean. I've been weak for letting you talk about her like that." Rachel narrowed her eyes. She leaned closer to him, her voice lowering, but still cutting. "Don't forget who keeps this family afloat. Without me, you'd be nothing but a small-time manager at a failing company." The words stung me even from outside. I could only imagine what they did to him. He ran his hands through his hair, pacing, now his steps unsteady. "Stop it, Rachel. Just stop," she smirked, relentless. "Admit it, Mark. Without me, you'd still be begging your mommy for help." Something broke in him then. His voice rose raw and shaking. "Maybe you're the real leech, Rachel." The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating. Rachel froze, her mouth opening as if to reply, but no words coming out. For the first time, she looked rattled, as if Mark had struck a chord she did not want to hear. Inside the house, Emily's footsteps creaked down the stairs. She carried a stack of folders for her donation project, but when she reached the bottom step, she stopped cold. She had heard it all. Her wide eyes moved between her uncle slumped in the chair and Rachel standing stiff and pale. I knew then I couldn't stay hidden outside. I tapped gently on the door. Emily rushed to open it, relief on her face. "Aunt Mary," she whispered, her voice strained. I stepped into the hallway with the coats, forcing my tone to remain calm. "I brought what you asked for Emily." Rachel turned toward me, her expression shifting instantly into something cold and polished. "Mary, how nice of you to stop by." Her voice was deep, her smile forced. Mark didn't look up. His head was in his hands, shoulders hunched as though the fight had drained every ounce of strength. Emily placed a hand on his arm, but he barely moved. I placed the box on the floor and straightened slowly. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and tension. My heart ached seeing my son like that, torn between his wife's poison and the loyalty he still held somewhere deep inside. Rachel broke the silence, her tone coated with bitterness. "Well, I'm sure your mother's thrilled to have witnessed this little scene." Mark lifted his head finely, his eyes red but steady. His voice cracked, but his words cut through the air. "She doesn't need to see anything, Rachel. She's lived enough of it already." Rachel's jaw clenched, her body rigid. For once, she had no sharp retort. Sensing the heaviness, I gathered Emily's things quickly. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's give them some space." Emily hesitated, her eyes still on Mark, then nodded and followed me outside. The night air was cold, but it felt like a release compared to the suffocating air inside. Emily clutched the folders to her chest, her face pale. She whispered, "I've never seen Uncle Mark like that." Neither had I. Driving home, my thoughts swirled. The cracks in their marriage were no longer hidden. Mark had finally thrown Rachel's cruelty back at her, using the very word she had once used against me. Leech. Back in my living room, I set down my coat and sank into the armchair, staring at the flickering light of the lamp. I pressed my hands together and whispered to David's picture on the mantel. He finally said it. He finally sees her for what she is. The house was quiet, but for the first time in weeks, the silence did not feel like defeat. It felt like the beginning of a shift, small but undeniable. Their union was unraveling thread by thread, and I could sense that no matter how hard Rachel tried to weave it back together, something fundamental had already torn apart. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest that refused to lift. The image of Mark burying his head in his hands, Rachel standing rigid with fury, and Emily's pale face at the bottom of the stairs lingered like ghosts in my mind. I wandered through the house in silence, unable to focus on breakfast or chores, the clock ticking louder than usual as if urging me to do something. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold before I touched it. The folder Richard Thompson had prepared for me lay open beside it, the trust documents neatly aligned, the pen clipped to the top. Every time I looked at them, I thought of David's steady hand guiding me years ago when we signed them together. Back then, it had felt abstract, a safety net we hoped never to use. Now those pages felt like a shield I had been foolish to ignore. Around mid-morning, the phone rang. Richard's voice was calm, but I heard a firmness underneath. "Mary, it's time. If you want to secure your accounts and prevent further misuse, I can prepare the freeze order today. All it requires is your signature." I gripped the receiver tighter, my knuckles whitening. Part of me wanted to beg for more time to wait until Mark found his footing, until Rachel lost interest, but I knew better. Rachel was not the type to back down. She would push until she found a crack, and Mark, for all his good heart, would let her. After hanging up, I called Ruth. Within half an hour, she was at my door, brushing snow from her boots, her eyes filled with concern. I poured her tea and told her what Richard had said, my voice wavering. She listened quietly, then set her cup down firmly. "Mary, sometimes people only learn when they lose. If you keep saving them, they will never see the value of what they had." Her words stung not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I closed my eyes and remembered Rachel's triumphant smirk at Christmas, her arrogance at the bank, the way she dismissed me as a burden. If I stayed silent, I was giving her permission to keep tearing away pieces of me. That afternoon, I drove downtown through slush-covered streets, the windshield wipers fighting the steady drizzle. Richard welcomed me into his office, the warm light of his lamp casting a glow over the polished wood desk. He slid the prepared documents toward me, each page neatly tabbed with markers showing where to sign. "This order will freeze the joint accounts Mark and Rachel manage that still include funds you contributed," Richard explained. "They will not be able to withdraw or move the money without your consent. It is completely within your legal rights as trustee." My heart clenched. I imagined Mark opening his banking app and seeing the error message, Rachel raging when she realized her access had been cut off. The thought of being the cause of their panic twisted my stomach. But then I imagined Rachel forging my name again, or Mark walking into my kitchen with yet another request, his eyes pleading. The ache in me deepened, but so did my resolve. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling. Memories flooded me, each one a thread pulling me back. Mark at 5, running into my arms after his first day of school. Mark at 16, grinning when I handed him the keys to the used car I had worked overtime to buy. Mark at 22, crossing the stage to accept his diploma, his smile wide and proud. I blinked hard, forcing the tears back, and signed. The ink spread across the paper in loops and curves, shaky but final. When I set the pen down, Richard gave a small nod of respect. "You've taken control, Mary. It was not easy, but you've drawn a line that needed to be drawn." I left the office feeling both hollow and strangely lighter. The cold air hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, the city alive with honking horns and rushing footsteps, yet I felt detached, caught between grief and relief. I had done what had to be done, though the ache of it pulsed with every heartbeat. At home, Ruth was waiting with a pot of chicken soup simmering on the stove. She listened as I told her about the signature, about the way my hand shook about the weight that lifted and settled all at once. She hugged me tightly, her voice steady. One day Mark will understand. Right now, he needs to see the cost of his choices. That evening, I sat alone by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily beneath the streetlight. The house was quiet except for the hum of the furnace and the soft ticking of the clock. I reached for David's photograph on the mantel and traced the edge of the frame with my fingers. "I signed the papers today," I whispered. "I finally did what you always told me to do. Protect myself. Protect what you left for me." For a long moment I stood there staring at the gentle smile frozen in the photograph, the kind eyes that had always seen further than I did. I realized he had known this day might come, that Rachel's ambition and Mark's weakness could one day collide with my silence. He had left me the tools, and now I had used them. The ache of loss and love filled me as I set the photo back on the mantel. I turned off the lamp and let the house settle into darkness, the papers locked away in the safe. The decision had been made, and the first true step in my fight had begun. On the morning of January 25th, the winter light crept slowly through the blinds, pale and heavy, casting long shadows across the floor. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it too was waiting. A full month had passed since that Christmas dinner when Rachel had hurled the word leech at me in front of my family, and nearly 4 weeks since I had sat in Richard Thompson's office, my hand shaking as I signed the papers that would change everything. Since then, I had carried on as if nothing was different, cooking, reading, walking to the corner store, but deep down, I knew the storm I had set in motion would eventually reach them. Rachel had always strutted through life as if she were untouchable. She loved being seen, adored the spectacle of wealth. That morning, she headed into downtown Seattle, her heels clattering across polished floors, her designer bag slung confidently over her arm. She drifted through racks of dresses and handbags, plucking what she pleased, tossing jewelry boxes and perfume into the crook of her elbow without a second glance at the price tags. She was already on her phone with a friend describing an imaginary trip to Palm Springs, talking about champagne brunches and poolside cabanas. At the checkout, she placed everything on the counter, her smile wide, her head held high. The cashier rang up the mountain of items and waited. Rachel slid her platinum card across the counter with a smirk. Declined. She blinked, tilted her head, and told the cashier to try again. Declined. A bead of sweat formed on the cashier's temple as the line behind Rachel grew restless. Rachel's voice grew sharper. "Swipe it again. Use another terminal." The manager was called over, his tone apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, the system will not authorize the transaction. Perhaps you should call your bank." Rachel yanked another card from her wallet, then another. One after the other, the same red word blinked across the screen. Declined. 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 Rachel's face turned crimson, her composure cracking. She slammed her hand on the counter. "This is absurd. I have money. Run it again." People in line exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others whispering. For the first time in years, Rachel's show of superiority faltered. She shoved the bags aside, grabbed her phone, and stormed out into the parking lot. In the cold air, she dialed Mark. The fury in her voice was so loud it carried across the pavement. "Your mother did this. Don't you see? She froze everything. She wants to ruin us." By evening, Mark was at my door. His eyes looked sunken, his coat half-buttoned, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Mom, what happened?" he said before I could even greet him. "Rachel couldn't pay for groceries. The account is locked." I guided him into the kitchen, poured tea, though he didn't drink it. "The bank acted under the trust," I explained gently. "The funds in that account were part of what your father left. They were never meant to be squandered." Mark paced across the kitchen floor, his voice thick with frustration. "Rachel says you want to humiliate us, that you're punishing us." I met his eyes steady despite the ache in my chest. "I did it to protect your father's legacy and to protect you even if you can't see it now." His lips parted, his hands raking through his hair. He looked so young in that moment, so lost, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "I don't know how to fix this," he muttered before walking out into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left alone with the cooling cups of tea and the steady hum of the furnace. The next day, the consequences deepened. Evergreen Projects, the company Mark had poured years into, had been clinging to a contract worth nearly $500,000. The financing depended on access to credit tied to that same account. Once the bank registered the freeze, they pulled their support. The deal collapsed within hours. Mark called me from his office, his voice hollow. "Mom, the contract's gone. The bank pulled out." His words trailed into silence, heavy and raw. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the muffled voices of co-workers, the sound of failure pressing down on him. And then Rachel's voice erupted, shrill and venomous. "She wants us crawling to her. She wants us to beg. She destroyed everything." I held the receiver to my ear, my heart twisting, but I forced myself to stay firm. "You cannot build on what isn't yours," I said quietly. Mark didn't respond. The silence stretched long before the line finally went dead. That evening, Ruth came by, her scarf damp from the drizzle, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried a casserole dish in her hands and set it on my counter without a word. She studied me, her eyes both kind and resolute. "It's begun, hasn't it?" she said softly. I nodded, my throat thick. "He's hurting Ruth." I can hear it in his voice. She touched my hand, steady and strong. "Sometimes they need to hurt before they see clearly. You couldn't keep shielding him forever." After she left, I walked slowly through the house, the weight of the day pressing against me. The clock ticked in the living room, steady and relentless. I stopped before David's photograph on the mantel, tracing the edge of the frame with trembling fingers. "A month ago, she called me a leech at my own table," I whispered. Tonight, she was the one screaming in a store, her cards worthless in her hand. The snow had started again, outside, light flakes swirling beneath the lamplight. I drew the curtains and sat in my chair by the fire, listening to the wind brush against the house. My heart still ached for Mark, for the boy I had raised, but beneath the ache was a steel I had not felt in years. The tide had shifted. The humiliation I endured that night had been replaced with something stronger, steadier. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was no longer drowning under Rachel's contempt. I had taken a step she never expected, and now she was the one flailing. I whispered into the quiet room. They know now. They finally see where the power lies. The fire crackled, the house settling into its silence. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the neighborhood in white, covering the cracks and scars of the past month. But inside, I felt the weight of justice beginning to take form. Each flake, a reminder that winter could also cleanse, could also clear the ground for what was to come. The Saturday after the accounts were frozen, I asked Richard Thompson to accompany me to Mark's house. The city was draped in a heavy mist that blurred the skyline, and the streets glistened with rain that had fallen steadily all morning. As I drove, the wipers kept a slow rhythm, and I gripped the wheel tightly, my stomach in knots. Beside me, Richard rested a slim leather folder on his lap, his expression calm but serious. Inside those pages lay the truth I had carried for years, the truth Rachel had mocked and denied, the truth that would change everything. When we pulled up in front of Mark's house, I saw the curtains twitch. A moment later, Rachel opened the door, her face pale, her eyes flashing with suspicion. She stepped aside stiffly and we entered. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Mark sat on the couch, slumped forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet as if it might give him answers. Rachel led us into the living room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She crossed her arms and stood by the window, her chin tilted high. Richard set the folder on the coffee table, unfastened the clasp, and removed a stack of documents. His voice was steady, professional, yet every word struck with the weight of a hammer. Mr. Hamilton, Mrs. Hamilton, I am here today to review the legal structure of the Hamilton Family Trust. This trust was established by David Hamilton in 2015, 3 months before his passing. Under the terms of the trust, all major assets, including this residence on Green Lake Avenue and the savings accounts totaling $500,000, were placed under the sole authority of his widow, Mary Hamilton. Rachel let out a sharp laugh, but it was brittle-edged with panic. That cannot be true. Mark's name is on the mortgage. He has handled the accounts for years. Richard did not flinch. The trust supersedes those arrangements. Any accounts tied to this trust remain under Mary Hamilton's control. He slid the notarized papers across the table. You are welcome to read them yourselves. Rachel snatched the documents, her hands trembling, as she flipped through page after page. Her eyes darted across the text, desperate to find a loophole, but the ink was clear, the signatures undeniable. Her smirk collapsed, replaced by a pale mask of disbelief. Mark finally lifted his head. His eyes were wide, his face drawn as if the floor had vanished beneath him. He pressed both hands over his mouth, his shoulders shaking. For years he had believed Rachel's version of things had let her lead him into arrogance and distance. Now the truth stood before him in black and white, undeniable and final. I leaned forward, my heart pounding, but my voice calm. Rachel, on Christmas Eve, you stood at that dinner table and called me a leech. You told me to get a job to stop depending on you. My words trembled not from weakness, but from the force of memory. And now, 1 month later, you see who has been depending on whom all along. Rachel's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She stumbled back a step, the papers slipping from her fingers and scattering across the floor. The sound of them hitting the wood echoed like a verdict. She spun on her heel, her heels clattering against the tile as she stormed toward the door. The slam reverberated through the house, shaking the picture frames on the walls. For the first time since I had met her, Rachel had no words. No smirk, no pretense. She left with nothing but humiliation. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mark's sobs. He lowered his hands and looked at me, his eyes red, his face streaked with tears. Mom, he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. I am so sorry. I moved closer and placed my hand on his shoulder. You are my son. I have always wanted the best for you, but letting her use me, letting her twist you against me has to end. He buried his face in his hands again. I should have defended you, he choked out. I should never have let her speak to you that way. I sat beside him, letting the moment breathe, the truth finally settling into the space between us. Richard quietly gathered the scattered papers, tucking them back into his folder. He glanced at me with a nod, then excused himself, leaving Mark and me alone in the heavy silence. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the house settling around us. Finally, Mark whispered, "I thought she was strong. I thought she made us better. But she only made me weaker." I squeezed his shoulder. "You are stronger than you know. You just forgot where you came from." His tears flowed freely, his chest heaving as years of denial cracked open. I let him cry, my own eyes burning, my heart torn between grief for his pain and relief that the truth was finally visible to him. Outside, the rain continued to fall, streaking the windows with silver lines. Rachel was gone, her fury echoing in the distance, but her absence filled the house with a strange quiet. It was not peace yet, but it was the beginning of something closer to it. I sat with my son, listening to his quiet sobs, knowing this was the moment when everything turned. The shame of that Christmas night no longer weighed only on me. It had shifted, landing squarely where it belonged. The house felt unbearably still after Rachel's footsteps faded into the night. The air was heavy, as if all the shouting and tension had left behind a residue that clung to the walls. Mark sat slumped on the couch, his face buried in his hands, and I stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to speak or to let the silence do the work. The rain beat against the windows, steady and unrelenting, filling the space between us with a rhythm of its own. The next days passed like slow waves breaking on the shore. Rachel did not return. Instead, rumors began to drift through the community. Neighbors whispered that she had stormed into real estate offices, demanding meetings only to be shown the door. The story of her forged signatures and failed deals had spread farther than she expected. Partners withdrew, clients stopped calling, and the once confident woman who thrived on attention was left standing in empty lobbies with nowhere to turn. The industry she once used as her stage had quietly exiled her. Mark tried to focus on evergreen projects, but the company was already crumbling. Without the major contract, without the financial support Rachel had always promised would come, his employees lost faith. One by one, they resigned, leaving empty desks and silent phones. The office that once buzzed with energy became a hollow shell. Mark confided in me in a voice heavy with defeat. "I walk into that building, Mom, and I can feel the end in the air." I listened without judgment, though my heart broke for him. "You cannot keep carrying something that has no foundation," I told him. "Sometimes letting go is the only way to stand again." Within 2 weeks, he turned in his resignation. The papers were brief, the ink barely dry, but they marked the end of years of chasing a dream that had never truly been his own. He came to my house afterward, shoulders slumped, and set the letter on my kitchen table. "I failed," he whispered. I shook my head gently. "Failure is refusing to learn. This is not the end. It is the beginning of something different." Meanwhile, Rachel had moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. I heard she spent her days pacing, making frantic calls that went unanswered. Her nights filled with anger that no longer had anywhere to land. She left messages for Mark, for acquaintances, even for me, but her words had lost their sting. The woman who once called me a leech was now adrift, and the world she had built on arrogance and manipulation had turned its back. Emily visited often during those weeks. She would bring over bags of groceries, insisting on cooking dinner with me, her laughter filling the rooms that had been silent for too long. She helped me sort through old boxes in the attic, listened as I recounted stories of David, and reminded me that family was not measured in money, but in loyalty. One night she clasped my hand tightly and said, "Aunt Mary, you showed us all that dignity is louder than shouting." Her words filled me with warmth, and I knew she had carried the lessons further than I imagined. Ruth, too, was by my side, steady as always. We shared quiet walks through the neighborhood, stopping at the market or pausing by the lake to watch the ducks scatter across the water. She reminded me often that justice is not vengeance, that standing firm had allowed me to protect what mattered without losing myself. Her friendship was an anchor when the storms of guilt threatened to pull me under. With Richard's guidance, I made a final decision. I did not want to leave Mark destitute, nor did I want to feed old habits. Together we set aside a modest portion of the trust for him, money he could use to rebuild if he chose wisely. When I told him, his eyes filled with tears. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I don't deserve this, Mom. I don't deserve your kindness after everything." "You are my son," I said softly. "I cannot walk your path for you, but I will not cut you off from the chance to walk it right." The community, once dazzled by Rachel's bravado, began to see me in a different light. Neighbors waved warmly, some stopped by with kind words, and at church people clasped my hands and whispered their respect. The humiliation of that Christmas night faded as the truth spread, replaced by a quiet recognition that silence had never been weakness. One crisp afternoon in late February, I drove to the cemetery with a bouquet of winter roses. The ground was damp, and the air smelled of earth and rain. I stood before David's grave, the stone cool beneath my fingertips, and let the silence settle around me. For a long while I said nothing, only breathed in the stillness. Then my voice came quiet but certain. I did what needed to be done. Our family has felt pain, but justice has been honored. A breeze rustled the bare branches, carrying with it the faintest sense of his presence. I imagined his steady eyes, the smile that had always reassured me. I whispered again, "I did right, David." It hurt, but it was right. Mark is learning, and I am still standing. I placed the flowers at the base of the stone and straightened slowly my chest, both heavy and light. The ache of the past months had not vanished, but it had transformed into something sharper, clearer. Strength. As I turned to leave, I looked back once more at the grave and spoke aloud the lesson that had carried me through. Sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is the first step toward power. And to those who hear my story, remember this: silence can be strength. Share your thoughts, hold on to your dignity, and stay close, because in every family there are lessons to be learned and stories yet to be told.